The spring of 1917 was exceptionally cold. In the third year of the war, the battlefield was littered with frozen bodies of soldiers, but the brutal battle continued endlessly. Henry, a 19-year-old German soldier, was urged by his squad leader to fight. One second he was calling for help from his comrades, and the next second he fell in a pool of blood. He knew that the war was meaningless. During this period, the front line had only advanced less than 100 meters, and there was no possibility of winning. Every soldier at the bottom was dying, but he had no choice but to force himself to rush forward. At this time, Germany was already at the end of its strength. When the focus turned to the country, the fanatical speech that only by fighting bravely and making achievements on the battlefield could Germany become a great power on the European continent continued to brainwash the people in the rear. Paul, who had just come of age, was an ignorant and passionate young man. In the teacher's propaganda that glorified the war, he gradually became excited, and all the young people present were also excited. They firmly believed that it would only take a few weeks to take down Paris. Paul and his childhood friends signed up for the army without telling their families, fantasizing that they could win the victory and go down in history, becoming respected national heroes. They would never have thought that this would be the last time in their lives. At a respectable moment, when Paul was queuing up to receive his uniform, he found that the name on the uniform was wrong. Why was it written Henry? The officer skillfully tore off the label and explained that it was returned because Henry's horsemanship was not suitable. Paul didn't know that this was actually a uniform taken from the dead. Henry had just died in the battle and was carried out of the dead. After taking off his uniform, he was buried in a mass grave. These blood-stained clothes filled the train carriages. After being sent back to the country, they were simply rinsed and dried in a large water tank, and then they were sent to the factory to be mended and then sent back to these ignorant recruits, who thought they were wearing new uniforms, but in fact they were just going to the front lines to die unjustly and become the next Henry. After only 2 days of training, Paul was sent to the Western Front in France. The weather here was quite bad, cold and humid. The first task he received was to deal with the accumulated water in the trenches, which was far from Paul's grand ambition to fight on the battlefield. Being assigned to stand guard in the middle of the night was another boring and difficult job. Paul was so itchy that he fired a shot at the corpse. The next second, the other side immediately fired back a bullet, which directly shot off his helmet and narrowly escaped death. Paul was so scared that he trembled all over. After all, if he had gone 2 centimeters lower, he would have died directly. The fear was not over yet. A flare flashed across the night sky. The French army suddenly launched an artillery bombardment. The recruits quickly hid in the air raid shelter. The original high spirits on their faces were instantly swept away. They all curled up and shivered. They just wanted to go home to their mothers. A soldier could not stand this depression environment, and as soon as he ran to the cave entrance, he was blown into a bloody mist on the spot. After continuous bombing, the air raid shelter was razed to the ground, and the surrounding area collapsed into a mess. Paul survived by chance, but many people were not so lucky. Seeing the bodies of his classmates lying in front of him, Paul realized the cruelty of war, but he had no time to grieve. He immediately began to collect the name tags and clothes of the dead so that they could be recycled for the new soldiers in the rear. There was no time to breathe in the war. These young people who should have stayed in school had to fight all their luck to survive the first day of the battlefield, let alone become heroes. A year and a half later, the war was still going on. The German army was on the decline, and there was no sign of advancement on the front line. Paul had long been numb to it. There was no longer any expectation of victory. In his spare time, he and his teammates would run to the local farm, risking bullets, just to steal a goose and have a good meal with his brothers. Only at this time could these young people temporarily get rid of the haze of war, relax and chat about family matters, and look forward to life after the war. Everyone knew that Germany was about to lose the war, which was a good thing because it meant that they would be home soon. The German generals were holding secret armistice talks with the Allies at this time, but some high-ranking pro-war leaders believed that a ceasefire was necessary. I agree that it is a national disgrace. So, after a brief ceasefire, Paul went to the battlefield again. Throw a piece of meat to a dog and he will definitely take it away. Give people a little power and he will become barbaric. Politicians who advocate war never go to the battlefield themselves. As long as they use the power in their hands, they can make those low-level soldiers charge forward with bayonets like gears in a machine factory. With only 3 days left before the end of World War I, the German army was at an absolute disadvantage. The soldiers were waiting in the trenches, but they all knew in their hearts that the war was about to end, and both Germany and France were already at this time. In the carriage, they were discussing an armistice agreement, but the generals who advocated the war still gave the order to charge. At the command, Paul rushed out of the trench with his comrades. In the crazy strafing and bombing, comrades kept falling down. Just to advance the front line by 100 meters, countless lives had to be sacrificed, which was almost meaningless. Paul rushed into the French trench and began to kill without emotion, but when he saw the handsome young enemy soldier in front of him, he couldn't help but kill him. At this time, his teammates immediately made up a shot. Several people rushed into the enemy's kitchen. The table full of food made them stop. There was a fierce fight going on outside, but these people hid, hiding inside and feasting on the food. But after a while, the ground suddenly began to tremble, and groups of rats came out in droves. Was it an earthquake? A few people went out to take a look. In a blink of an eye, the outside was already dusty and the sky had changed. It turned out that the French tanks came to fight. After entering the decisive battle, humans used tanks on the battlefield for the first time. Facing this advanced steel beast, bullets had no way to deal with them. A few artillery shells came over, and the German formation collapsed across the board. The tanks directly crossed the trenches above the soldiers' heads and ran over them. The soldiers were frightened and wailed wildly. The scene was extremely tragic. Experienced soldiers, throwing a grenade to stop a tank only helped Paul to regain a small advantage. But the French soldiers who followed him sprayed flamethrowers and turned the battlefield into a living hell. Paul saw his former friend being burned to death, and his defenses collapsed completely. Finally, the order to retreat was conveyed from above. Everyone was like ants, running for their lives surrounded by fire and puddles. Paul accidentally fell into the puddle. He could only lie on the ground and pretend to be dead, hoping to escape. But at this time, an enemy behind him discovered him, and Paul quickly took the opportunity to run over and engage in hand-to-hand combat, stabbing several times in a row. He was relieved after stabbing the other man's chest. But he didn't expect that the Frenchman would not die. The dying breath made Paul very painful, but he suddenly came to his senses at this moment, and his long-suppressed humanity slowly revived. The other man was actually just like him, just an ordinary person who was running for his life. He wanted to save his life, but the other man was too seriously injured and eventually died. Paul found some photos and letters on the body. The Frenchman he killed had a family of 3. He was an ordinary typesetter. If it weren't for the war, he would have died. War should have led to a peaceful life. Paul put away the letter and promised to make it up to him. From regret to self-blame, even in hell, Paul still retained the good side of his humanity. Afterwards, he walked back to the base camp alone. The soldiers here were all celebrating. It turned out that they had received news that the ceasefire negotiations had come to an end and everyone could finally go home. But an old friend of Paul had to have his leg amputated to save his life due to a serious injury to his leg. He dreamed of going home to be a policeman and was completely desperate and could not accept this fact. While Paul was not paying attention, he stabbed himself to death with a fork in his neck. Medical staff, no one was available to rescue them, and the soldiers around them just watched them coldly. They were no longer surprised by suicide. In this way, on the last night of the war, Paul sent away another good friend. He survived the war, but he could not survive the defense line in his heart. At almost the same time, the Allies formally accepted all the conditions for surrender. Just now, the Armistice Agreement of World War I was officially signed and will take effect at 11 o'clock in the morning. If they hold on for another 6 hours, the war will be over. Early in the morning, Paul and his teammate Kate woke up and felt for the first time that the outside world was so peaceful and serene. The two decided to steal a goose from the farmer's house to celebrate. Paul climbed over the wall and got a goose egg when he was discovered by the French farmer. Several bullets passed by him and Paul ran away. The two ran for their lives. The goose eggs in their pockets were broken. In order not to waste them, they beat the eggs in the lunchbox, stirred them casually and drank them raw. The taste was sour and refreshing. Indeed, Paul went to the woods alone to relieve himself, but when he turned around, he found that the farmer's youngest son had followed him, holding a shotgun in his hand. Paul heard the gunshot and hurried over to check. He found that Kate had been shot in the abdomen, but the wound was not big. Paul supported her and walked slowly to the base. On the way, friendly vehicles passed by, and the soldiers cheered and celebrated loudly, not caring to stop at all. Seeing Kate getting weaker and weaker, Paul could only carry her all the way back. After finally sending her to the infirmary, the doctor said that Kate had died. Paul couldn't accept the news. He was only one step away from home. He was talking and laughing with his fellow villager 1 second ago, but he died the next second. But who can he blame? The rest of the soldiers were not much luckier. The crazy general actually ordered an attack in the last hour before the armistice for his so-called self-esteem and honor. Hearing this selfish order from their superiors, the soldiers naturally refused to obey, but the few who took the lead in the resistance were immediately pulled aside and shot, and the other soldiers were forced to go to the front again. At this time, there were only 15 minutes left before the end of the war. Paul charged with indifference, while the French army over there had already opened wine to celebrate. They didn't expect such a thing to happen until they heard footsteps and hurriedly took up their guns to be on guard. The German army once again rushed into the French position with countless sacrifices. Paul had no feelings at all. He killed the enemy when he saw him, like a ruthless war machine. But soon after he was angry, he met a tough guy and almost lost his life several times. The two wrestled all the way and finally fell into the air raid shelter together. When both sides stood up, it seemed that they had a tacit understanding and kept their troops in place, thinking that they would just delay until 11 o'clock. But unexpectedly, the next second after Paul was pierced in the heart was exactly 11 o'clock, and the war was officially over. The enemy soldier glanced at Paul and then left silently. Paul also walked out of the air raid shelter with heavy steps. At this time, the smoke was still everywhere, but the soldiers on both sides had stopped. The First World War was over, and the remaining soldiers were still busy collecting the name tags of their teammates who had just died in the battle, and Paul's young life was forever frozen at this moment. The passing of individual lives is so understated in the face of the grand history of mankind, not worth mentioning. The most ironic thing is that there was only one sentence in the German war report that day: no war on the Western Front. In 1928, German youth Remarque, who returned from the front, published a battlefield story based on his real experience. There were no spectacular war scenes in the book, only cruel and dirty deaths. Once it was published, the novel became a global hit. In 1930, it was adapted into the first version of a movie, which won many awards including the Oscar for Best Picture and Best Director. It is still regarded as a peak of war movies. Unfortunately, when it premiered in Berlin that year, thousands of cockroaches and rats were put into the theater under the planning of warmongers, just to prevent the German people from watching this movie. The movie was banned soon. A few years later, ordinary Germans who had not yet developed wisdom were brainwashed by the war frenzy again, and went to the battlefield of World War II with the absurd passion to reproduce their great achievements. This meaningless cycle is like the clothes that are collected and recycled again and again in the movie. The life value of the brand name individuals is erased and they become consumables on the war assembly line and screws in the war machine. They are not even more valuable than a few pieces of cloth and iron. Now, although it has been nearly a century, we can find that both the story itself and the audiovisual scenes are still the same. The theme of the book is that the 5 soldiers on the Western Front are not outdated at all. The senior leaders who have never been on the battlefield regard war as a joke. They eat big meals, drink fine wine, command soldiers to die in luxury houses, and constantly use the so-called glory to brainwash waves of young people in the rear. The first thing they learn in society when they become adults is to kill. With the baptism of rounds of soldiers on the front line, they gradually give up thinking and become soulless killing machines, and then die one by one, being crushed into cannon fodder under the dream of the empire. No one wants to reach this step, but all the bottom soldiers. There was nothing they could do except kill each other. Their physical destruction was nothing more than a seemingly elegant but in fact extremely barbaric bargaining chip at the negotiation table. It is sad that nearly 17 million people died in World War I, and World War II doubled this number. Too many families were wiped out in an instant. All Quiet on the Western Front is a story told for a whole generation of victims, and the warning we can learn from it today is that nothing is more important than cherishing peace.